Hello and welcome to Juice with Justin. Deadlifts. Bad. What? More better. Why we typically don't do conventional deadlifts. What is a conventional deadlift? Essentially, it's when you have a barbell on the ground, your feet are usually hip width apart, hands on the outside of your legs. You use mostly the muscles on the back side of your body to pick up that weight. This exercise will target all those muscles on the posterior chain of the lower body. We're gonna work our back extensors, our lats, our trunk. It's essentially a total body exercise. At PPC, the deadlift gets categorized under one of our PPC pillars. That's the hinge movement. The hinge movement primarily involves a hip dominant movement. Most of its load is being generated from that hip joint, as opposed to say something like a squat, which is more of a knee dominant movement. So why is the deadlift bad? We have this quote here at PPC. Move well first, then load it. Otherwise, you're just getting better at doing something poorly. The hinge movement, specifically the conventional deadlift, is one of the trickier movements to fit well with all types of people. We don't want to put a square peg in a round hole, and in my experience, that's usually what happens with the conventional deadlift. A lot of people have trouble moving well first when it comes to the deadlift. They don't have the necessary hip mobility, trunk control, strength, ability to control their body, ability to move well in that bottom position. That bottom position of the deadlift on the ground would be where we are at our weakest. So in sense, we're already starting from this negative point. The deadlift is not for everyone. Let's compare this between two individuals. Like the average Asian individual who is 5'7" to 5'9" in height. Their levers, their limbs aren't as long. They are gonna be more predisposed, better be able to do a movement like this compared to a 7-foot basketball player who has extremely long levers, high center of mass. And that individual getting down to the ground to be able to move well, it's just gonna be more difficult. And if we can't move well and we do an exercise, we just get better at doing it poorly. And when we do an exercise poorly, we're typically not going to be able to access like the feelings, like the muscles that are supposed to be worked. You're going to be feeling pain in the low back, maybe some tightness in the hips, maybe the quads working more than the posterior chain. And worst case scenario, doing an exercise like this when we can't move well could lead to an injury, and that's why we don't do that. What do we do instead? In order, how we teach a hinge movement, two-legged hinge movement at PPC, we'll start with a kettlebell deadlift, with the weight being in the center of the body as opposed to in front on the conventional. It just allows someone to get into their hips better and to start in a more optimal position at the bottom. From there, I would teach them a trap bar deadlift, very easy learning curve with the ability to really load that up. You can really go get some lower body strength gains in that movement. If we didn't have that piece of equipment available, I'd do something like a squat stance deadlift. This is sort of a hybrid between a conventional and sumo stance deadlift, where the conventional are feet hip width apart versus a sumo where your feet are super wide. The squat stance deadlift is kind of a happy medium. It gets you into the same positions as a kettlebell deadlift would, but we can load it, and it is a bit more of an athletic position. Lastly, if we're really set on deadlifting, this is something that I do as well, we can do a raised conventional deadlift. That's where the weight starts higher off the ground, and the height of that bar is really going to depend on what position you can get into. So you need to have the hip mobility, to be able to control your body, the ability to be able to move that load well. So that can be as short as a couple inches, all the way up to 30 centimeters. It really just depends on the individual and what their limitations are. That's sort of the progressions I would take someone through when learning a hinge movement from the ground. So why do we do these variations instead of the conventional? At PPC, we train mainly court and field sport athletes and the general fitness population. Unless the individual has a specific goal, like they need to do a deadlift for some reason, like they're going into a powerlifting competition, or if I have an athlete that when they go play sports with their team and in their team training, they're required to do conventional deadlifts, there isn't really a need to do them. The whole point of training for athleticism and the way that we train the general fitness population is to supplement, to aid, to complement their performance-based goals. So for an athlete, the strength training is to make them a better athlete so they can be better at their sport. For the general population client, it might just be getting stronger without pain, keeping up with their kids, being able to play weekend sports, things of that nature. If that's the goal, there's so many other ways to get there, like the examples listed above. We can get those same qualities from that PPC pillars movement from the hinge in things like kettlebell deadlifts, trap bar deadlifts, etc. And we get much more reward versus risk. In the hinge movement, the goal would be posterior train strength, trunk control. We want to not have them be injured, or that we want them to be able to move well. So we get much more benefits from doing the examples I listed compared to the higher risk versus reward that is the conventional deadlift. Another big reason why we do these other examples is there's a much easier learning curve. Easier to do, harder to screw up. The person gets more confidence. They're not scared about hurting themselves, and we have the ability to load up quicker. I mean, check, 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 check. All good things and reasons why we do alternatives. Lastly, and I've touched upon this briefly, the other variations that I listed, it gives us the flexibility to put the individual in a position that works for them. We're putting a square peg in a square hole, not a square peg in a round hole. By doing this, by having these options and not being rigid as the conventional deadlift is, the person in front of you can then move well, they can load it, and then they can get better at moving well. Full disclaimer, we don't never do conventional deadlifts. I've done them in the past. I've had clients that had the deadlift as a goal. I've had clients that just want to deadlift. So we do them. It's rare. It really just depends on the person's goals and the context around the training situation. Usually when doing conventional deadlifts with somebody, I first make sure that they're able to own that bottom position, own the end range, have the requisite mobility and strength to control those positions prior to performing that movement and loading it a lot. Essentially, ask yourself, can they move well? Check that off first. Do what you need to do to get there, and then load it and progress. For most people, there are much better options that yield more reward versus risk than a conventional deadlift. Move well first, then load it. That way you're getting better at doing something optimally. Thank you for watching this episode of Juice with Justin.